vivid dreams of your face and your people. TV screaming everywhere. That I wish I didn't care. Oh, you've been everywhere. I don't know, Conrad, or something in the air.
It must be.
Come on,
Aww.
say hey. Say hey.
You want to do the show with us today, baby?
Say Black Power Trappers.
What y'all doing?
Say Black Power Trappers. She just want to be in the limelight, y'all. Look, you not gonna exploit the revolutionary book trap because you want to be cute and in the camera, okay?
She said, why not, though?
It don't work like that. You could sit up here today, Miss Thing, but that's it.
Just today.
Black Power Trappers, y'all come on up in here. Come on up in this room. Make sure once you do that you share, put hashtag shared in the comments when you share Black Power, DP Black Power.
Hello, y'all.
What's up, y'all? What's up, what's up, what's up? What's up, what's up, what's up? Get buck, get buck, get buck. What's up, what's up, what's up? Ow, 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 ow. We need to start having the book trap. We need to have the book trap soul cipher.
Let's do it.
You know how...
Let's do it. I'm gonna unite. I'm gonna unite with it because it sounds like it'd be dope. So like,
you know, in a cipher, like that's when they freestyle, like in
I can't
yeah.
freestyle. I'm not even gonna lie to you.
You gotta try. You can write it out.
That's not freestyle. I thought freestyle.
Rob says, "Say less." Black Power, Christopher. It's fun. Chris. It's easy.
Yeah. No, it's not.
See, I'm gonna bust a rap. Real
I'm
quick.
not a freestyler. I'm not. I have tried, and it just never came out that way.
No. So like, how far you got? Like,
I might have done like one stanza, like one verse. I just can't do it because it's like I applaud people that can do it. Like I think Lil Wayne. I think they said that he got to a point where he doesn't even write his stuff anymore.
That he just goes in the booth and just
I can't
spit that fire.
And that's some real African, talent.
You know, the creative genius.
The ancestors did not bless me with that.
I feel you, girl. I feel you. All right, y'all. Let's go ahead and get this thing started. We would like to welcome you all to another episode of the Revolutionary Book Trap presented by Black Hammer with your boy, Chief Dia.
And that's what I was going to do, that kick. Chief Nyah.
Hey! And we got Y'all ain't playing with
I ain't gonna be able to do that for long.
But good morning and welcome, comrades. Welcome. And if you're just joining us for the first time today, which you shouldn't be, I mean, like, we've been going since, like... It's been a little minute. Like, this is our fourth book, right, I think?
Yeah, and this has probably been... It's been so, like,
in
good.
Depth.
But it has been really, really in-depth. But yeah, this is our fourth book, and we've been on it.
So you got to catch up. We are currently on How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which was written by Walter Rodney, and currently right now we are in the middle of chapter 4, which focuses on, Europe and the roots of African underdevelopment. So like at the beginning of this chapter, we went through the slave trade. And right now, the chapter is focusing on the political and military development of the African societies from 1500 up until 1885, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So up to this point, we have been right now, like last week, we're continuing with examples of African societies, in their development, and like their political aspects and their military aspects as well too. But before we jump into that, we want to give a revolutionary salute to the comrades out in Wilmington, Delaware.
They are doing their homeless clothes drive today, right now, as we speak. They're on 2nd and Jackson Street, so if you're out there, go pay them a visit. You can still send donations their way. You can send the donations to I want to say hashtag, but $BH East Coast. But they are doing that today on the corner of 2nd and Jackson Street. So make sure you pay them a visit. Share if you've seen the flyer. We really want to support them. They doing it.
And Comrade Vinny, watch it right now.
Out there working while you tuning into the book trap.
Black Power. And we also want to give a revolutionary salute to our comrades, Chiefs Gigi and Chief Robert, who did their hygiene drive yesterday in Orlando, Florida. We talked about it earlier today in our Forging the Hammer Political Education Monthly Study that we had this morning, and it was lit. Cannot wait to see those pictures come out, and just so great. And just to let y'all know, be on the alert, because the Atlanta unit, we are planning our next event. It's going to be a cultural explosion. Okay. So we still putting together the what do you call it, like the nooks and crannies, or is it like
we're putting everything together?
Is it the bolts?
The like nuts and the bolts?
Yeah, okay. I don't know where I got this again.
Whatever.
But whatever, y'all get the point. Black Power. So y'all make sure y'all share. All right, let's go ahead and jump right on into this thing. Okay, y'all. So again, we are in the middle of chapter 4, and now we are moving to the Eastern Interlacustrine states. And earlier within the book, we discussed this area, and as Comrade Walter Rodney laid out in the book, like the Interlacustrine states pretty much is all of Eastern Africa, where you have Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and those other areas as well. And pretty much he gave the overview that in terms of development, such as like technological advances and things of that nature, like this area in particular was very slow in development versus like West Africa, Northern Africa, and to some extent some of South Africa. And what we mean by when we say development, like we saw like class stratification take place more heavily and quickly in places that were involved with trade with Europe, who were directly involved in the slave trade and things of that nature. And pretty much you can almost, how I like to sum it up in my mind, it was like the Interlacustrine states was they kind of held on to their like innocence, I guess you could say. They weren't too much permeated by the European aspect versus the other parts of the continent. So that makes sense, right?
It makes sense. And it just, to me, I think he mentions it in one of the other parts, but where I think it's also like population was a little more sparse too, and there really wasn't as much of a need to really develop at the level that maybe some of these other places were. And then the fact that the slave trade wasn't necessarily impacting that area in the beginning as much as it had impacted some of the more Western civilizations.
Yeah. So he starts out with speaking to Bunyoro Kitara, which was and he lays it out as this, the Bunyoro Kitara as the most advanced socio-political formation in East Africa up until the 15th century. And they had their ruling dynasty at this time was the Bachwezi, and then he talks about their decline. And he doesn't say exactly what the reasons were, but one reason he makes a direct attribution is to the overwhelming by new immigrants that were coming down from the north into this area. And namely, he calls them the Luo peoples, which came from a section of the Nile that flows south of the Sudan. Mm-hmm. So there he goes through like the different lines of dynasty that took place, took power, during this time. And he talks about like this immigration and how like it was this kind of clash between the people who were there on the land versus the immigrants that came into the land. And he makes a point to talk about the Babito, I think that's how you pronounce that, which was the ruling class after the Bachwezi, and how they sought to take immediate control of the land, but they ran into opposition, of course, and they later tried to like project themselves onto the people who were to the African brothers and sisters that were already there. And then he makes this example where he says they had like this dialogue which came between like the member of the royal clan, meaning like the ruling class that migrated into the land, versus the commoner who was originally from there. And he says, the royal clan member, we found this place empty and made something of it. You fellows later came around begging for land, so we were generous and gave you some. Naturally, you are now our slaves. Now the commoner who replies, "Aho, what a lie. We were here long before you. You took your power by trickery. You princes have always been scoundrels." So there you have that. And then again, like how we were just talking about earlier in terms of like the class stratification, like this was more slowly to develop in this area. And he speaks about that as well too, where he says, at no stage in the independent history of these interlacustrine states did land become purely a personal possession to be monopolized by a given class, as in the classic European feudal model. Scholars frequently demand this feature before they concede that feudalism has arrived. But they fail to take into account the reality of the fact that distribution in usufruct or produce of the land may be in the hands of a few, and they fail to realize that where cattle were a dominant form of wealth, then private ownership of herds were also part of a process by which producers were separated from the means of production. To be specific, those who owned the herds were usually the Bahinda or other Bahima or the new Babito families, while those who tended them were clients and virtually serfs of the owners. As far as land was concerned, the peasant who farmed it paid a heavy tax and crops to the clan heads and ruling authorities to allow the latter to live without resort to agricultural work. So this is pretty much the mirroring of like what we saw in like other areas, in other African societies in terms of like class stratification and the rise of the ruling class. And like, as we're speaking about the Eastern interlacustrine states, so we also have to keep in mind that a lot of these African societies were composed of pastoralists and cultivators. And pastoralists, which were mainly those who had like the cattle and things of that nature, and the cultivators who pretty much worked the land. And like, so for example, as he speaks to the Babito families, these are the families that had access to the cattle. So therefore, this is what gave them the so-called like upper hand. Yeah. So, yeah. And later on, in speaking to the interlacustrine states, he also talks about the different kingdoms as well too, which you have Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. And he also makes points to speak about Northeast Tanzania, which was, he says, the most developed portion of the country in the pre-colonial epoch because of the rest of the mainland. Tanzania comprised numerous small kingdoms that had not divisively left behind the communal stage. So even in these areas, you still see like remnants of communalism, you know,
right.
within these areas as well. So, yeah. Had anything you want to add, comrade?
No, I mean, I appreciated this piece in that it really just summarized like everything that why it hadn't developed maybe to, I guess, like where the other parts of Africa had been exposed to the slave trade and their, especially their population being, you know, undermined by that. And how even though because again, this is before colonialism had impacted this area, you know, they were still developing on their own time scale. They didn't really, and I appreciated that. I appreciated that even seeing that the class stratification was occurring, anyway, into like feudal-like states. You still had the exploitive nature of, okay, well, you guys are going to work the land and we're going to basically call the shots on, this, we're going to take this wealth and we're going to distribute it back to you as we see fit. I mean, I do appreciate that. I appreciate seeing that that's how that developed in these societies that were further removed from that, from the damage that was done.
And just to, like speak to the point that you just made, like he also speaks about like the economics of this area as well too. And he says that the Baganda state, which was, in this area that we're speaking to now, had a very strong agricultural base. Yeah. Meaning that, just like you said, being that these areas weren't involved directly in the slave trade or within European trade, period, they were able to trade internally to create this base. And he says the Baganda state had a sound agricultural base with bananas as a staple and with cattle products being available. Their craftsmen manufactured black cloth for export, and local production of iron and pots was supplemented by imports from neighboring African communities. Yep. So like these are again, areas, African societies that are not involved in the slave trade. And so when you aren't involved in the slave trade, you are able to focus more on your development internally. And he says their lack of salt was a big stimulus to the extending of their trade network to obtain necessary supplies, and as was true of the Western Sudan, such as an extension of the network of commerce and in effect integrating the productive resources of a large area.
I appreciate that too, because where he says that, it outlines the fact that where they didn't have something, then they used that as an opportunity to trade with a surrounding community, so that they could work with that community to get something that they need. So they didn't have salt, so they traded something that they did have in order to get a return for salt, and that facilitated a healthy, non-exploitive trade relationship.
Yeah,
I really appreciate that.
And I think we have to read that back in the comments.
Yes, Comrade Alex.
Y'all sleeping on Comrade Alex. He's so
dependable.
He always coming with his hashtag read that back. If you hold on, Comrade. Y'all need to step y'all hashtag read that back game up, cause Alex is shitting on y'all.
I mean, and he's so dependable. I really appreciate your participation.
Black Power, Comrade Alex.
But he says the Batutsi are one of the tallest human groups in the world.
Oh wait, Comrade, we ain't got there just yet.
Okay.
Okay, but we gonna. Well, you can read it. Go ahead.
Okay, we'll read it and we'll get there. We'll go into it more. Are one of the tallest human groups in the world. The Bahutu are short and stocky. I remember that. Yeah, and the Batwa are pygmies. And the pygmies, I think, are the ones who migrated to Australia. I think. Am I right about that? Oh no. Okay. I think they are. I think they are.
Sure, Conrad.
I think they are. The difference can be explained largely in terms of social occupation and diet. Ethnic differences are developed socially. Biology follows distribution, and class differences first, not the other way around. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, we're gonna get there.
Black Power. Well, yeah, we pretty much there. So next we're talking about Rwanda. And so Comrade Walter lets us know that Mainly, this area was split into two different social groups at this time. So you had, well, first let's talk about which composed this area. And he says the westernmost portion of the interlacustrine zone comprised the kingdoms of Rwanda and Burundi. Mm-hmm. These two countries, which today hear those names, are centered around the old kingdoms. The experiences of Rwanda can be cited here. So so he's talking about the two major social groups right now in this area, and that is the Bahutu, and they are the cultivators. Mm-hmm. And he says that the political power was in the hands of the Batutsi mm-hmm. pastoralists, comprising about 10% of the population. So he says an even smaller minority was the Batwa, about 1%, mm-hmm. who were at a very low level of pre-agriculture social organization. So just like what Comrade Alex was able to lay out just now in his hashtag, read that back, he even goes on, let me stop right there, because we just talked about, we had a discussion, I can't remember, I think it was a public meeting that we were discussing, and I think Chief Ghazi raised the point about how when you look at the Africans on the continent, we're more smaller in structure.
Oh, yeah.
And things of that nature, versus Africans stolen away to America, are more broadly and bigger and things of that, muscular. Yeah. And he tied it to the fact that, on these different slave plantations that were in America, and then just thinking about the plantations that were solely dedicated to breeding, mm-hmm. African slaves, and just the fact that what the slave masters did, what the slave owners did, were they bred a particular African woman and a particular African man to produce,
a machine,
mm-hmm. To produce a slave that could
work and withstand the harsh work conditions, mm-hmm. that of course they didn't want to work in, but they wanted a specific type of human or slave to produce that type. So they wanted the big, strong, mm-hmm. Man that could lift and be out in the sun, and then they wanted a woman that could do the same thing and would be optimal for producing more slaves.
Mm-hmm. And then also, how Ghazi was saying that in the islands, you see coming from Jamaica, Trinidad and things of that nature, you see a lot of our African brothers and sisters participating in track and racing and running and things of that nature. And that is directly tied to the fact that slave owners in those areas needed slaves that could run really fast, due to the terrain of these areas and them not having an ease of access to the coast and things of that nature. So yeah, that's so crazy. Mm-hmm. And he says that, he goes into how the differences between their social occupation and the diet. So he says, again, the Batutsi are one of the tallest human groups in the world. The Bahutu are short and stocky, and the Batwa are pygmies. The differences can be explained largely in terms of social occupation and diet. The Batwa were not living in settled agricultural communities. Instead, they wandered around in small bands, hunting and digging roots, thereby failing to assure themselves to plentiful or rich food. Yeah. At the other extreme, the Patutsi pastoralists were subsisting on a constantly accessible and rich diet of milk and meat. The Bahutu were more socially advanced than the Batwa. They ate more and more regularly than the latter because Bahutu agriculture meant they did not have to live entirely on the whims of nature, following scarce game like the Batwa. However, the quality of their food fell short of the protein-rich Batutsi. So, yeah. So next he lays out like he goes into their political and military achievements. And where he says right out, in any event, it was their political and military achievements rather than their height which distinguished the Batutsi from a historical viewpoint. Their contribution to the kingdom of Rwanda goes back to the 14th century, to a period contemporaneous. That's right. I think that's right. With the Batwezi. There were indeed striking parallels and actual links between Rwanda and Ankole and between Karagwe and Burundi. But unlike Buniyoro Kitara, Rwanda in the 14th and 15th centuries was far from being a single political entity. There were several small chiefdoms, and it was the expansion of a central Rwanda Tutsi clan which gradually created a small compact state in the 17th century. Later still, that central Rwanda state extended its frontiers, and it was still doing so when the colonialists arrived. So pretty much what Walter is speaking to here is the consolidation of the state. And as he lays out, we understand that Rwanda, again, was comprised of small different chiefdoms in this area. And like he says, the Tutsi clan was the only only group in this area that was working to really consolidate a state.
One state, yeah. And then he goes on to say, even the leaders, which was called a Mwami, that they were kind of sanctioned by religious beliefs and things like that, which is another thing that Walter Rodney has continued to say throughout this book, how the foundation of religion has been used as a means of control, forming of the state, which is similar in nature to the feudal kings of Europe, which were also said to be tied to, having some sort of, divine right to be there, or to have that position as king. And this particular kingdom, or the Mwami, was said to have done that similarly as well. So I found that I did find that interesting, in that was something that was already taking place. With the erection of the state.
And he speaks about two Mwami in particular, and the first one he speaks to is Rujugira.
Okay, we're gonna go with that.
Okay. Was a famous Mwami of the 18th century, and the last of the independent line was Rabuguri.
Yeah.
Who died in 1895. Gahindiaro is another whose praises were sung by the court musicians and historians. Each of them was associated with one or more contributions to reclining and elaborating the power structure of the state, which meant they each embodied certain historical class and national forces. And later on, he goes on to speak to, further down in the paragraph, he says, early in the 19th century, Mwandi Gahindiro overhauled the civil administration. In each province, there was created both a land chief and a chattel chief, one being responsible for farm rents and the others for cattle dues. So here we see, the production of class stratification. Therefore, the implementation of the upper class, pretty much, in this African society.
Yeah.
And he says, besides, there were smaller district authorities or hill chiefs within all the provinces, all members of the Batutsi
aristocracy.
Whether by accident or design, it turned out that administrators responsible for different areas and different matters were jealous of each other, and that kept them from uniting to conspire against the Mwami. So even here, we see that the Mwami are already being identified as the ruling class. So instead of the smaller chiefs, uniting the people within these African societies to uprise, they were bickering against each other.
And then the power structures were just gaining more strength to do that, to be able to continue to do what they were doing.
Black power. So, yeah. So he talks about that. And let's see, what else do we talk about in Rwanda?
It just said, like, he goes on to say that the system of relations which emerged in Rwanda was more completely hierarchical and feudal than in most other parts of Africa. So that was happening there more, which is, I don't know, because he had said before that these particular inner lacustrine states, they were actually further behind, but to say that they were more hierarchical and feudal, I guess that just means that they, had the class stratification was more evident than it was in other places. I found that interesting.
Yeah, and just the fact that, even when we're talking about development, like in terms of like class stratification, for what it meant for like the interlacustrine states in terms of like cattle and like other products that were created in this area versus what gave the classes that we saw in the other African societies their status in terms of being able to sell slaves to the Europeans and to also who had access to, I guess you could say, like European goods. Like that's what represented the class question for them versus the interlacustrine states, which were more of a, like agriculture, like pastoralist.
Ties to the land.
Yeah, ties to the
like
land.
That.
So even though it's different, in terms of what the economic base is like, but you still saw the class stratification in the, as Rotter refers to it here, like the caste system, develop in these areas too. So yeah,
access to cattle, that just meant that if you had that, you had the upper hand in creating that, because I guess they also use, aside from production of food and milk, they also produce clothing, skins from the hides.
And there was even though we see the contradiction in it, but outside of that, like, these areas were free to develop on their own. They were still developing and evolving as like, I guess like social structures or whatever, like going from communalism to feudalism and things of that nature. But I'm saying that to say that a lot of these areas were their paths were directed of their own independence, like they were evolving independently, versus like the other African societies who did have ties to the slave trade and things of that nature, who at different points in time led to their own destruction by participating in the slave trade, and then also not being able to center, their labor, their development or whatever on their internal development, because you have to think about the fact that they had to worry about being sold into slavery.
Right.
They had to worry about the pressures of the Europeans coming and, demanding more slaves and things of that nature, versus like what we just laid out with Wanda, who was able to work on iron making, who were able to work on cloth development, who were able to work on, like agriculture things, and things of that nature.
And developing like a pretty strong, like even military, and creating with weapons and things of that sort to give them the ability. Because I don't even think that it said it wasn't that they weren't aware that there were threats or external threats that existed, but they were able to do that as well, to find ways to protect themselves against external dangers and things of that sort. So I do appreciate that. I appreciate the fact that we're looking at, again, like you said, just the development of their ability to develop without the interference, especially without the interference of their people being, stolen from them, and their population being at risk of being able to further grow.
Yeah, and he even says the important thing is that they were free to develop relatively unaffected by alien influence and certainly free from direct ravages of slave trading. So, all right, next we are going to talk about the Amazulu. So this portion of the chapter was very exciting for me because when you hear Zulu, automatically you think of Shaka Zulu. So we are getting ready to speak about this brother. But first, before we get into that, Comrade Walter speaks about, again, the freedom from slave trading in these areas. And he says, the same freedom from slave trading was operational in South Africa. For West Africa, exports of captives began in Angola, and East African exports came from Mozambique and zones further north. The area south of the Limpopo was one that had some of the simpler social formations in Africa up to the 15th century. The eastern side was sparsely peopled up to a late day by the Khoi herdsmen, who were slowly edged out by the Bantu speakers. When European ships touched on the Natal coast in the 16th century, it was still a region of widely scattered homesteads, but in the years to come, the population became denser and important politico-military development took place. Now, before we get into Shaka Zulu, I can just remember growing up in school and how Shaka Zulu was, in turn used as an insult. Being in elementary school or middle school, you would have, our darker complected brothers and sisters, they would be called African booty scratchers. I've heard Shaka Zulu, people being called Shaka Zulu and things of that nature. And of course, that we're dealing with colonial constructs that have been imposed upon us in terms of when it comes to, standards of beauty and things of that nature. But we're talking about Shaka Zulu, which is one of the most influential and most important leaders, period, to ever be alive. And even though Walter Rodney doesn't go into all of everything of what Shaka was able to accomplish, I just encourage comrades, everybody else that is watching right now, that you do your research to really understand, even though Shaka Zulu was centuries ago, the example that he still continues to set for us right now, especially in terms of us as freedom fighters, in fighting for the revolution, just the fierceness of this, I'm gonna say comrade, of this ancestor, pretty much this is the lineage where we extend from. So
it's amazing.
It is really, really amazing.
The fact that he was able to shape just such a significant political structure in the area. And I mean, he only lived 40 years. And for him to do everything he did in that short period of time, it was just, this brother was moving. Yeah. So let's talk about
Shaka for a little second. So he says, Shaka was born about the year 1787, and the impressive achievements attributed to him in his 40-year lifespan, just 40 years, can only be briefly enumerated here. By 1816, he was head of a small Amwa Ngoni clan, the Amazulu. Within a few years, he had reorganized it militarily, both in terms of weapons and the tactics and strategies of war, so that the Amazulu clan became a feared fighting force. Through warfare and political maneuvering, he united and commanded the Ama Ngomi, which had previously been divided into dozens of independent or semi-independent classes. At one point, it seemed as though Shaka was about to unite under one rule the whole of the region that is now Natal, Lesotho, and Swaziland. That task was not accomplished when he met his death in 1828, nor were his successors able to maintain Shaka's sway. But this man lived for 40 years, only 40 years, and in that span of time, he was able to unite What does he say? Okay. He was able to unite the whole of the region that is now Natal, Lesotho, and Swaziland.
Yeah, that's like 3 different areas. That's a fairly large area.
That is a very large area. So, he also says Shaka grew up at a time when the questions of unity and of effective armies were being posed seriously for the first time among the Ama and Ngoni. Previously, the clans, which generally coincided with chiefdoms, displayed a tendency to segment or break into smaller and smaller units. Excuse me. As the eldest son of a clan head grew to adulthood, he went off to settle his own corral and a new junior clan was born, for his father's clan remained senior and its headship passed to the eldest son of the great wife. That pattern or segmentation was possible so long as the population density was low and land was plentiful for farming and grazing. Under those circumstances, there were little competition for resources or political power, which you was talking about earlier, Comrade Nyah, and wars were hardly any more dangerous than a game of football in Latin America. Usually, a clan had traditional rivalry with another given clan. They knew each other well, and their champions fought in a spirit of festivity. 1 or 2 might have been killed, but then everyone went home until the rematch. So, yes.
Yeah, I just think that what he was able to do was just amazing and everything. And then just giving some outline from where he came from, the fact that he took on that mantle of starting his own clan with his crowd, which I think is just basically access to like his own, I guess, piece of land.
Yeah.
And then just being able to, really practice your military stance and everything in a festive way to where it's going to help make your skills stronger and everything. And then, like, I highlighted this. It says, early in the 19th century, the casual tempo of Amazulu life and politics changed considerably. The greater population meant less and less room for junior members to hive off on their own, which meant that the population was growing and it was less. They were less able to, start their own like civilization there because land was becoming more competitive to get. It meant less grazing land for cattle and disputes over cattle and land. And the Amazulu began to fight more frequently, so they began to feel the necessity to fight more effectively. So the need to develop their military, skill was, necessary for that reason. At the same time, senior clan heads began to recognize the need for a political structure to ensure unity, the maximization of resources, and the minimization of internecine conflict, that's meaning conflict among them. So I thought this was important because it just highlights the fact that, as you get more people in a concentrated area, there becomes, it appears that what's being laid out here is there becomes the need, and not necessarily for the state as we know it, but for a governmental structure that's going to keep people, organized and utilizing resources the way they should be utilized.
Exactly. And then just to, speak to, and I mean, I don't want us to just, of course, a lot, the contributions that Shaka Zulu was able to make, I mean, are innumerable. And in terms of the political and military, development that he was able to offer the Amas, the Zulu land, they call it, the Zulu land. I mean, at that point in time was just something that was unheard of. And just to give an example of that, it says the era of conflict and warfare in Zululand in the early 19th century brought troops face to face much more often, but the pattern of military encounters still remained that of the long distance hurling of the light kanto or spears. For close fighting, a weapon grasped in the hands is much more damaging, as feudal armies discovered in Europe and Asia and therefore resorted to sword and pike. Shaka, while serving as a young soldier, came up with the solution of devising a heavy, short assegai, which was used purely for stabbing rather than throwing. In addition, he discarded the loose sandals so as to achieve more speed in closing with the enemy and more dexterity at close quarters. Through experience, Shaka and his fellow youths then discovered the specific techniques of using their shields and asagis to best effect.
So yeah, they're perfecting their skill and everything. So they're like, we're gonna get some sandals that's not gonna come off our feet, so we can run and get these niggas when they're running from us.
Right.
And and then they're discovering. I mean, so development is very much present in there, and the fact that this brother discovered that and this formulated one of the best militaries of this time, that he's still talked about today. I mean, that's something to be recognized. That's profound right there. So I love that part where they talked about that.
And then, I think what's also important for us to, highlight in this chapter as well, too, is just, Walter is able to, pretty much lay out, we understand who Shaka Zulu is and what he represented, and just the fact that Walter speaks to the fact that, Shaka Zulu was just your ordinary African man, and was basically shaped by his environment and what social forces that he came in contact with. And he makes that point by saying I'm going to read this first and then I'm going to go back to the point I'm trying to make. But Shaka was able to invest his talents in creative energies in a worthwhile endeavor of construction. He was not concerned with fighting for or against slave traders. He was not concerned with the problem of how to resell goods made in Sweden and France. He was concerned with how to develop the Zulu area within the limits imposed by his people's resources. It must be recognized that things such as military techniques were responses to real needs, that the work of the individual originates in and is backed by the action of society as a whole, and that whatever was achieved by any one leader must have been hounded by historical circumstances and the level of development which determine the extent to which an individual can first discover, then augment, and then display his potential. To substantiate the above points, it can be noted that Shaka was challenged to create the heavy slabbing assegai when he realized that the throwing spear broke when used as a slabbing weapon?
Stabbing weapon.
Okay. More important still, what Shaka came up with depended on the collective effort of the Amazulu. Shaka could ask that a bigger aside be forged because the Ama Ngoni had been working iron for a long time, and specialist blacksmiths had arisen within certain clans. It was a tribute to the organizational and agricultural capacity of the society as a whole that it could feed and maintain a standing army of 30,000 men, re-equip them with iron weapons, and issue each soldier with the full-length Zulu shield made from cattle hide. And I mean, that's very important for us to understand, because pretty much Shaka again was shaped by, the historical forces that was taking place on the continent at that time. And I think it's important that we speak to this point, because that is what is shaping, us as African and indigenous people, as colonized subjects at this time. And, we face so many different aggressions from the United States government, and, the contradictions of colonialism on a day in, on a day out. So these are the motivating factors that must push us to become organized, and not just organized, but to be better organizers. You know what I'm saying? And it's just for example, when we talked about it in the last, it wasn't the last episode that we had, but when we talked about, how we see African and indigenous people, participating in these unsavory acts, or whatever you want to call it, such as robbery and things of that nature. But we understand that it is the historical forces of this time that has pressured us, that has pushed us to move in this way to, again, survive. So just like with that understanding, that is why it's so important for, African indigenous people to come in contact with revolutionary theory. So we have this basis for understanding like why it is so important that we get out in the street and we organize our brothers and sisters.
Absolutely. I unite with what you said 100%. And I also found it, there's 2 points I wanted to go into, but I wanted to read some of the comments really quick. Black Power Monique, thank you for joining us. And Juanita said, colonization is the theft of a people's evolutionary process, social and political, economic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I unite with that. And then, let's see, Monique was responding to camera, said, I know most people only know the lies that was fed to them at the master's table. Our history is here. We just have to reach for it. So we just have to, we have to go look for our own, history. So I appreciate those comments. Also, but what I wanted to go back to was I liked how Walter Rodney laid out like how Shaka's legacy could have been, again, so underdeveloped or non-existent had he been somebody who had been stolen and taken to a plantation in Mississippi. And he mentions on page 131, he said a great deal more could have been added concerning Amazulu political institutions and its army, but what is relevant here is to understand why a Shaka was possible in Africa in the 19th century, which is, we're talking about 1800s, before the coming of colonial rule. Has Shaka been a slave to some cotton planter in Mississippi or some sugar planter in Jamaica, he might have had an ear or a hand chopped off for being a recalcitrant nigger, or at best he might have distinguished himself in leading a slave revolt. For the only great men among the unfree and the oppressed are those who struggle to destroy the oppressor. On a slave plantation, Shaka would not have built the Zulu army and a Zulu state, that much is certain, nor could any African build anything during the colonial period, however much a genius he may have been. And I appreciate that because, I'll say this. We pretty much built everything in this colonial state that we know as the United States, but it doesn't serve our purposes at all. We've not been able to build anything that is for the African nation or for the indigenous nation or for any colonized nation. It all serves for the purposes of the colonial state. And I appreciate him laying that out because we sit here today, like when you look at today and you see what's purported as like some of the best colonized African people that you could look up to. They're all these black capitalists and people who are like building for the interests of the colonial state, and their resources will never go towards the funding of an African-centered school or rebuilding some of our neighborhoods that are rampant with poverty and drugs and things of that sort. But I really appreciate him laying that out to kind of highlight the fact that Shaka's legacy in Africa was what it was because of the lack of interference from European interference. And I really also appreciate it where he talks about Shaka's kind of the preceptor for Shaka from the Dengizwayo, and how he followed in their footsteps with their political method, and he perfected it, and just made it. It just says he greatly improved it, and that's how he was able to become like the good warrior the great warrior that he was. So I appreciated that too.
Black power. So yeah, Walter Rodney pretty much wraps up the rest of this section by, just pretty much giving a general overview of, like the areas which were most advanced by the 15th century. And he talks about how these areas were they were kind of sort of able to maintain their standards in terms of, like a communal society and things of that nature. And he just he talks about Zimbabwe, which progressed with only slight interference from the Europeans. He says that locally, the center of power shifted from the Mutapa to Shangamra. I hate not being able to.
It's the Europeans' fault.
I know. And eventually, in the 19th century, the Nguni groups overran Zimbabwe. So long as the Nguni were warrior bands on the march, they obviously proved destructive, but by the middle of the 19th century, the Nguni had already spread their own state-building techniques to Mozambique and to what is now southern Rhodesia, and had joined with the local population to establish new and larger kingdoms. So what is evident, like, throughout this whole thing is that we, like, can you read the comment that the sister said about colonialism interrupting the
Yeah, I know most people only know the lies that was fed to them by the master's table. Our history is here. We have to reach for it. Stop expecting colonizers to save us or offer support. The information is readily available. I'm just at the beginning of unraveling the madness I was taught.
Hold on, no. It was the other comment where she says, like, colonialism
is theft. Oh, yeah. Okay. Colonization is the theft of a people's evolutionary process, social, political, and economic, etc.
And that is exactly what we are speaking about right now in this chapter. And even though, I don't really feel comfortable with speaking to, the fact that, communalism, like the next phase of communalism is feudalism. Like, because even when you understand what feudalism is, like what we saw in Europe and things of that nature, like the contradictions were numerous. And I'm saying that because we as African people were robbed from the opportunity to even criticize what feudalism was, being that it was interrupted by, colonization. And we have to ask the question of what would have happened if our process of internal development, evolution, socially, politically, military, and things of that nature wasn't interrupted by colonialism. And then, this is probably for another conversation, but even the fact that, I believe that Walter Rodney was a Marxist, if I'm not mistaken. I think I read that somewhere. And, Marxists have this pretty much belief that the next phase of feudalism is capitalism.
Like it's just a natural progression to it.
And that's not true. That is not true at all. And I think, I can't remember if it was Comrade Muhammadu, which comrade, who raised the point that when you look at feudalism and what that was like, I think it was Comrade Z who made this point, that pretty much capitalism was the spread of feudalism, like all around the world. And when you look at feudalism, the structure is pretty much based with, you have the king, the queen, the aristocracy, like the lords and things of that nature, pretty much the ruling class. And then under that, you have like the serfs, the peasants, and things of that nature. And I mean, like, that is so true. That is so true. So like, for us to even think that for African societies, like if we were left to our own internal development, to say that we would develop from communalism to feudalism to capitalism, that makes absolutely no sense at all. And that's not how that would have happened. And I just appreciate being able to be exposed to this type of literature and for us to have this type of discussion. Because when you think about like the what ifs, it gives you the incentive to say, okay, well, how we here now, how can we change the situation now to where, like, you know, first of all, it speaks to the immediate interest of our people, but then we do go to communalism, then to socialism, and, you know, things of that nature. Like, cause it's just that's not the natural process. Like that could not have worked.
I think that, because I think that naturally we are a people who everybody wants a good quality of life, but to share that quality of life with someone else. Mm-hmm. And for there to be a society that's non-exploitive, I think is the key here, because the feudal structure is an exploitive one. At the end of the day, you have a few people that are dominating land, resources, and they're exploiting labor from the masses of people. It's never meant to be where there's a few people that are toiling the land and the rest of us are, and it's not even, that's still exploitive. And everybody should have the same, you know, access to being able to get what they need from society, whether it be in the form of healthcare, whether it be in the form of housing, whether it be in the form of being able to, you know, have a family and you know, have a good quality of life. Everybody should have access to that. So I do appreciate that. I think I read somewhere that he's a Marxist too. What I can appreciate what he's laid out though is a lot of Marxists, they skate around the significance of African exploitation and indigenous exploitation in I guess in what contributed to capitalist society today, or they kind of make it seem like an afterthought, sort of like it was consequential, it was in there, but not really, like, you know, and that it still has ties to it today. But he's clearly laid out that that's not the case. It did totally underdevelop the entire continent as a whole, to the point where the fucking population was stagnated for centuries, where it didn't even grow. And you could almost immediately, once the slave trade stopped or slowed down, almost see an immediate growth. Wasn't by much, but a growth in the African population. So
Black power. All right, comrades. So for our next reading assignment, we are going to go ahead and cover the coming of colonialism and colonialism and imperialism, right? Yep. And then from there, we're going to go into chapter 5 all the way up until the subtitle that reads Shipping and Banking Services. So you have the ending of chapter 4, which is the coming of imperialism and colonialism, all the way up until shipping and banking services within chapter 5. So we got it's a little thick bit.
That's 2 chapters.
But we're gonna get through it, comrades. Like, we a little over halfway through the book, but. So that's from the coming of imperialism and colonialism up until shipping and banking services. And the title of chapter 5 is
Africa's Contribution to the Capitalist Development of Europe, the Colonial Period.
And the beginning, it's a saying here that says the colonies have been created for the metropole by the metropole. Sales operations in the United States and management of the 14 plants are directed by Lever House on New York's fashionable Park Avenue. You look at this tall, striking glass and steel structure, and you wonder how many hours of unpaid black labor and how many thousands of tons of underpriced palm oil and peanuts and cocoa it costs to build it. You scared, Giselle? Say bye to the people. Say bye. All right, comrades. Y'all enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Until next time, Black Power.
Black Power.